Let me just introduce myself. My name is John Alschuler. About 40 years ago, I created a company, HR&A, devoted to addressing the core issues confronting major American cities. There is no more serious issue that America has dealt with over the last 2 generations than its crisis of affordable housing. It is a crisis of enormous national significance. It affects every neighborhood, every city, every region in our amazing country. And it's sobering to think both how daunting it is and how little progress we've made since Franklin Roosevelt 80 years ago said we had a nation 1/3 ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-fed. Now, the good news, and there's a lot, is that over the last 80 years that we as a nation have attempted to address this, we've learned an enormous amount. One of the things which is absolutely clear about our crisis of housing affordability is it's fundamentally a problem of political will. We know what needs to be done. We know very precisely how to address this problem. There are a combination of things that some of the more progressive cities in America have done. You have to address your zoning codes. It's, as Minerva and others made clear, the ability to build houses of obscene size and dimension when you can't build affordable housing. And it doesn't mean changing the character of our towns. If you took, 5% of our land, as an example, 8% of our land along our major zoning corridors and in our downtowns and created modest incentives for densification, we could dramatically affect. So it's not about changing the character of our towns. We love our towns, and they will forever be predominantly single family. Predominantly doesn't mean exclusively, and it doesn't mean using single family housing as a form of racial exclusion and a form of economic elitism, which too often it has become throughout our country. We need to change our building codes. Our building codes, in many times, artificially increase the price. We need to, as Fred and others have taken extraordinary leadership, provide financial resources so that we have the money to provide clear and coherent programs. We need capacity. Long Island's blessed with a lot of extremely competent, very sophisticated organizations, but building affordable housing is complicated. It requires a whole series of activities, and developers of our predominant housing stock are incentivized to do that. They work through the permitting and design and construction. Well, somebody has to do that, and we need to invest in our affordable housing infrastructure, the organizations that can actually make this happen. If we do all of those things, we can make a significant dent. I think, as Tommy John very appropriately said to us, this is a massive market failure. It's going to continue. It will worsen because these are very powerful embedded trends in our society. But we can make fundamentally important steps to keep what is precious for us about this community, which is not just our bays and not just our fields, but the diversity and inclusionary character that many of us, particularly in Sag Harbor, treasure and believe that the character of our communities is not just what we look at physically every day and the beauty we're very fortunate enough to experience, but the character of our communities are the people that are here. And much of that character is sadly being lost. There's been enormous damage over the last 20 or 30 years. What's done is done. I think we as a community just have to keep working with our extraordinary elected officials and others and keep building the political will and just remind ourselves we know what to do. It's completely achievable. The only question is, do we have the political consensus of the community to support our elected officials, reward them for their leadership, and continue to prod them to keep working with us to expand what we know we're able to do here. I've been lucky enough to work with some of the most interesting mayors and governors and community organizations and advocacy organizations in the United States. Recently, communities have begun to learn. We represented the city of San Jose in a very long, very difficult, contentious relationship with Google. And before they allowed Google to come in and build a 5 million square foot campus, we created a massive community preservation housing fund. We worked with Amazon when Northern Virginia was fortunate enough to get a 5,000 job commitment from Amazon. We represented the communities and worked with Amazon and created a $250 million fund that we manage on behalf of Amazon now that provides affordable housing finance all throughout Northern Virginia, so that the community is able to say, yes, we have the jobs, and yes, as Bonnie Michelle very appropriately said, we're going to work hard to be sure local people get a lot of those jobs, but we're not going to allow those jobs to come in and completely change the character of our community, so that the net effect is to push out people for whom this has been their community for their whole lives. Now, one of the treasures we have here are our people. Now, we have 3 treasures up here. Each one has made enormous contributions. Fred is really a leader for a generation here, and the leader in the creation of the housing fund that Michael talked about. Tom, who's done so much to maintain the civic infrastructure and character of Sag Harbor, and Susan Mead, who not only has a generation-long experience in affordable housing, but gives so generously of her time and intellect to many of the aspects of the community of Sag Harbor, including her enormous contribution to the Sag Harbor Cinema, the board of which I'm lucky enough to chair. And we have Minerva here, who's on our board, and April, who really helped create it. So what I'm going to do is ask each of them to maybe spend 5 minutes. And I'd like you to address really one core question at the beginning, which is, when you think about affordable housing, who are you thinking about? One of the challenges in affordable housing is it's one of those phrases that in this room we can all say, we're all in favor of it. That's why you're here. You wouldn't be here if you weren't in favor of affordable housing. Most of the most unpleasant challenges I've dealt with are really the fights within the affordable housing community. Are you dealing with workforce housing, which in this community can be $110,000, $120,000 a year salary, 120% of median? Are you, as Michael talking about, dealing with people at 50% or 40% of AMI? And it's not an easy question, because if I'm subsidizing people at, call it 100% of AMI, as opposed to people at 50% of AMI, well, if I'm dealing at 100% of AMI, I can build twice as much housing for the same price. I can help twice as many families, because the math's very simple. It costs me twice as much. If I have limited funds, it costs me twice as much to help somebody at 50% of AMI than it does to help somebody at 100% of AMI. So I balance volume versus depth and need. Am I dealing with single families, for whom they might need 4 or 5 bedrooms? Or am I dealing with efficiency apartments, which are really helping young people come into the housing market? So it's unit count, it's depth of subsidy, it's housing product type. They're all affordable housing. And so what I'd like to ask the 3 of you to start, when you think affordable housing, what does that mean to you in terms of who we're dealing with and what we're offering them? So why don't we start with you, Fred? You've thought probably longer and harder about that than anybody else, and we'll just go Fred, Tom, Susan. Here, use this one.
Great, thank you. Well, I've never been called the treasurer before. for a generation. I just don't want to be a buried treasure. I'm not ready for that. So, you know, on the state level, you know, what I look to do as a member of the state legislature representing this community, and I also happen to chair the local governments committee, and this is really a local governments issue, is to provide the local governments with as many tools as possible to be able to address this problem, because ultimately the problem has to be solved locally. Even the courts recognize that in the Court of Appeals decision that deals with housing in the state of New York. Every local government, every village, every town, every city has the responsibility when they're zoning and their policies to provide for their share of the need in the region, the regional need for housing. So who is that in this community, I think is the question. And you know, when I think about it, I mean, first of all, it's that people should have choices. I grew up here. I've lived here all my life. My parents lived here. You know, we've been here a long time. There aren't that many of us left. But so certainly one of the things I think of is that people and families, folks that grew up here, people that went to Pearson High School, who go off to college, they may not want to come back, but they should at least have the opportunity to come back home. People that want to come to this community to work in this community, whether or not they are teachers, or they work at the hospital, or they work in a store on Main Street, wherever they are, if they work in this community. If you work here, you should at least have the choice, have the ability to be able to live here. And the perfect part of that we all think of is you know, where did you go to school? When I went to school in Pearson High School, you know, all of my teachers lived in the community. And you know, when school was out or there were extracurricular activities, they were around. You know, that's hard to do now because the workforce, you know, lives 40, 50 miles away. Every issue that we deal with on the East End, by the way, eventually comes back to affordable housing. Part of the traffic problem is because people can't afford to live here. They live further west, and then they have to drive on, you know, one of two roads, Montauk Highway or County Road 39. So people that have lived here, that want to stay here, people that work here and have jobs here, you know, those are certainly, you know, that's not an inclusive list, but it's a good start, I think. And I think, you know, we want to plan for a balanced community. You know, we need people that can be in the fire department. We need folks that as I said, they can teach, but you know, our volunteers, our ambulance. As I say, every issue comes back to affordable housing. Emergency services comes back to affordable housing. Traffic comes back to affordable housing. They all come back to affordable housing. So we have a very attractive community. People want to be here. Some people have more means to be able to afford to be here than others. And I think that has been the double-edged sword, is that, you know, we've created a beautiful community that and have protected a beautiful community where people want to be here. But, you know, we want to also make sure that we have a balanced community where everybody, you know, whether you work on Main Street or it's a seasonal home or whatever, there should be a place for everybody who if you grew up here, worked here, or you think there's an opportunity for you here and you want to come here, you should be able to live here. And you know, that at least initially is kind of how I view of who we're trying to plan for and who we're trying to provide housing for.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. I would say that when I think about affordable housing, I think of my family, my friends. I mean, I have people come up to me that I see at work that are like, hey, Tom, you know where I can find, I'm looking for an apartment. You know where I can find some place to rent? And sometimes I'm able to find them something, but as time has gone on, that has gotten to be almost impossible. I can give you a little story. Recently, Somebody that I ran into at work asked me about an apartment, and I was looking around. I couldn't find him anything. He wound up moving to East Islip, and he's driving an hour plus to get to Sag Harbor to work. So the government, our government here, okay, Sag Harbor Village, which legislates for 2 1/3 square miles, believe it or not, split between East Hampton and Southampton Town, has come up with a solution, or what we're intending to do to solve this problem. So a big issue is, and it's been said over and over, you've heard it, is the code, changing the code, or making the code more, creating more opportunities for affordable housing by changing the code. When I first started going to village board meetings, I'd sit in the back of the room and listen to the reports and watch as accessory structures were becoming more and more restricted, to the point where not even a water line was allowed in the structure, had to be removed. So now we're starting to turn the ship around and saying you can develop those accessory structures as long as it meets code, and create affordable housing. The village district, the office district, the code is being changed to allow accessory apartments. We're giving some relief to sewer credits. If you create affordable housing, you'll get, you won't have to pay the sewer tax for that. So we're trying to work with the community to create more affordable housing. And you know, the way I see government working is to create opportunity. If we're able to create opportunity and give people the opportunity to succeed and create, they will. That's how I believe it. I believe in this village and the people in this village. And just look around you. Look at what April and Eric have created here. We have the resources. We can do these things. We just need to create opportunity. And it's a personal issue, as I said. Friends, family, my friends in the fire department and the ambulance, they're holding on. A lot of them are renters. It's probably split 50-50. But, you know, things get harder and harder as time goes along. So I'll pass it on to Susan.
When I start talking, you know I'm not from here. So most of my affordable housing experience occurred in Texas, where I'm from. And I just want to tell you that I did big, dense projects in downtowns. So, but we looked nationally, a partner of mine and I, about 10 years ago, and did a report. Our firm supported us. But I've been doing affordable housing since the late 80s. And it depends a lot on your state laws, and kudos to Fred for changing these laws, because it creates more incentives, which means you'll get more housing. When I think of what is affordable housing, I think of housing for, and this is going to be very general as compared to these great people that gave specific examples. I think of elderly, disabled people that need housing. I think of family housing. I think of multifamily housing, and I think of artist housing. And fortunately, I've gotten to be part of development projects for each one. But I do want to make some comments about the policies that have to be put in place and the restrictions so that you get what you think you're going to get. We always did same door policies. In other words, whether it's an affordable unit or a mixed unit, and we like to do mixed projects rather than clustering all low income or all high income. That the appliances, the way the doors looked, they were all the same. You couldn't tell which unit was which, but you have to write that into the law. We did no clustering in the projects. In other words, you couldn't put all your low-income housing in one part of the building. They were spread out and commingled. And most importantly, you had a type of unit types, efficiencies, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, to ensure you have young people, people with 1 child, people with 2 children, and in some cases, not many 3 bedrooms, but if you can do it, that's great. And there's also in many of the later ones, the requirement that you accept Section 8 vouchers. We've talked a lot about income limits, and most of our projects were 80% and below of median income. And what that meant was the entry level secretary, paralegal, right out of law school, and you have a lot of debt type. But it catered to a mix of people. Some were low income with tax credits, et cetera. And the financial incentives on all these projects were important. You couldn't do it otherwise. And the laws did have to change. We did fee waivers, we did parking reductions, no building permit, et cetera, fees is what and also there was a requirement of architectural review in many cases. It wasn't, I know I'm from Texas and it's not all ugly, although most people think it is. We did some things, for example, we were screening roof mechanicals and things like that 20, 30 years ago. And Sag Harbor just put it into their code. So the point is that there's change to be made, and finally the village is doing it. But the regulations have to be pretty strict, and any, quote, deal with an affordable housing developer or someone who's going to do it, you have to specify these things or you will not get what you think you're going to get. You'll get all efficiencies because they're cheaper, easier to build. You can get more units. You need a mixture. So anyway, that's kind of some of my suggestions. Thank you.
Heard, is this working? Okay, what we've heard is there are really three different things here. One is let's create more opportunities in more places to build affordable housing. Let's make it cheaper to build affordable housing than it is today. Tom, your mention about fees is really important. And then let's use our financing tools so that we can make it more accessible. So why don't we take each of those? Why don't we start with, I'll start with you, Tom. If you were czar, we have a democratically elected government, that's a good thing. But if you were czar for a day, what were the changes you would make to the zoning codes of the East End towns that would make affordable housing more plentiful and easier to build? What would we do here?
I'm not so sure I want to be the czar.
Yeah, well, put it this way: you don't want to be a czar. He doesn't want to be a
didn't
treasurer.
end
You
too
know,
well.
I mean, everybody's got their problems, right? You know,
I mean, it didn't end too well for the czar.
Yeah,
I don't
you
know
know,
about
it's
that.
like,
I mean, you have to. I've been saying this over and over. You have to be good neighbors too. As Susan is saying, we're going to create the opportunity for affordable housing, but it has to fit in Sag Harbor. It has to be something that the residents are going to accept, and it's going to be, it's not going to be some, monolith like Susan says with efficiency apartments that, it's going to be Sag Harbor. Most of the stuff we create here in this village, I mean, look around you, we do it, I think, the best probably than anybody on the East End. I mean, I believe in this village, and I believe in the people in this village. But I think we have to stop getting away from, as Michael says, the NIMBY, not in my backyard. We have to start to think positively and start to create these opportunities. I don't think there's any edict I would put down saying you have to do this or you have to do that, because we all have to live together. I don't think there's any one thing I could say to any law that I would put down or any edict to make affordable housing, a reality. We all have to work together. I think the local government, our small government working with the state, somebody once told me that how do you eat an elephant? One small bite at a time. Is that right, Fred? Is that what you told me? Yeah. So
You got a lot of elephants to eat.
there's a lot of elephants. So this,
Take that however you want.
I hear you. So, those words ring true, right? Sag Harbor, we're I'll say it again, small village. We're going to take our little bite at this. And hopefully, people will create through these opportunities, and it will become a model for other villages and other towns and say, hey, look what Sag Harbor did. They did a really nice job with this. Let's try to mimic that. So that's what I'm hoping. That's the hope. affordable housing on the second, and I think there might be even 3 or 4 floors above it. Beautiful brand new units, and it works. There's a process for application, and it works. I mean, we have concerns about sewer, right? That's important. A lot of these situations where there's accessory apartments and we're making them housing might fall into upgrading the septic system to an IA system, which is beneficial. Is that lunchtime? Or is that a fire? Lunch, 12, okay. Every time I hear a whistle, sorry. So that's good for the environment, right? If we're able to convert outdated septic systems to IA systems, that's going to help the environment. If more people tie into the sewer, if it's available, because they've created low-income housing, or affordable housing, I shouldn't say low-income. But, on that stretch, I looked at the chart, and it showed that somebody with very low income is $50,000. I just want to make everybody aware, our police officers, police officer makes about $54,000 a year. So we're talking about, as Fred says, emergency services. These are the people that are being affected by this, and people that we rely on tremendously. So you want to add to that, Fred?
Well, first of all, you have to have a sense of place in where you are. And, you're not going to build 8-story, 200-unit apartment buildings, in Sag Harbor or on the East End. So as Tom alluded to, you need to have the necessary infrastructure. If you're going to have that kind of density, you've got to have sewer, you've got to have water. You should be relatively close to public transportation, another issue here on the East End. Close to downtown areas so people can shop. They don't have to get in a car. I think, those are the kinds of things that you need to look at. And, when you say multifamily, I think you're looking at relatively smaller developments here. Tommy John was on the prior panel, and, I think the towns will tell you if you get a project that gets much above 40 or 50 units, you're going to be looking at a lot of public opposition. So the idea is to get stuff built. So ideas like accessory apartments over stores, I think, are things that are really consistent with the character of life. We had no zoning here in the 1800s, and people figured out how to put apartments above stores and above these buildings in Sag Harbor. And maybe we can learn something from that. The other thing that I would just say, and certainly when I was thinking about the Community Housing Fund, is we need to be thinking, yes, about building how we can build affordable housing, and that's got to be part of the plan. But we are not going to be able to build our way out of our affordable housing problem here on the East End. First of all, we do not have the capacity to absorb enormous increases in density, and it's not just it's not just sewer and water, but it's traffic, it's schools, it's everything. So we also have to find a way to make the existing housing stock affordable to people, and there are examples of this all over the country. Shared equity was something that Tommy John referred to in the prior panel. In other communities, that have some sort of housing fund, they buy covenants and restrictions on existing houses to make them affordable. So there's opportunities to build, but I think there's also opportunities that we need to take advantage of with the existing housing stock also.
Well, I'll give you a personal story. I used to live at 286 Main Street, and in the Depression, that house was a 3-family, probably not legally, but, or maybe it was. And when I bought it, it was a 2-family, and I, unused as a 2-family, but nonetheless a legal 2-family. And I gave up the duplex zoning in order to get financing, because I wasn't rich enough to buy it outright, and I had to have a mortgage. Well, when the accessory apartment was put back in the code, or put in the code, I trotted myself down to try to get one, because I thought it would be a good idea. About $10,000 later, I gave up. Why? I had to pay the consultant fee of $5,000. That needs to be eliminated. I had to change the size of the window so there was an emergency exit. I figured out how to do that fairly inexpensively. The IA system you can now get, it costs $40,000, for example. You can get $30,000 back. So that fund has been replenished, so that's not a wild expense. But some of the things that Fred is suggesting and the village has already worked on and they're pending will help tremendously on the accessory housing end of it. A garage can be a place for somebody to live. A room can be a place for somebody to live. And we just need to, we don't want to change the way the historic district looks particularly, but we have some mighty big houses here that can have shared spaces and can house artists, can hire help with the restaurant owners that have employees, even teachers. I mean, this accessory apartment I had was literally 3 rooms and a bathroom and a little kitchen. It wasn't teeny. So, and the village is in the midst of doing all that. So if they create the financial incentives and get the restrictions eased as it relates to accessory, that will move along, I think, fairly quickly. The other thing in terms of multifamily, et cetera, the village is also working on, and I would encourage them to continue working on that. I'm chair of the ZBA, so I'm not going to talk about the existing ordinance, but I am going to suggest that they also look at unit mix so that you don't get all efficiencies and other incentives to make it possible in terms of fees, et cetera, which they're looking at. But the sewer fee, for example, the building of the sewer system, in the area where it can be built, there's a huge problem with groundwater. And it will be a very, very expensive fix in order to build anything there. So we have issues here that are all mixed up in terms of affordable housing and getting it done. But it's talent and money, and if we can get both, we've got it.
Sure, we'll take one question. Then we're going to do a forum at the end of the hour. But we're more than happy to
I'm
take
just
one
wondering
question.
if something like that, a huge expense, is something that the federal government comes in on and gives you subsidies.
You look well, how about a foundation? If a foundation loans money, so you get a low interest rate, the difference between the market and the low interest that they're charging can be a grant. If it's in their mission statement, and it's called a project grant. So that's something that we talked about doing with all the big foundations in Texas and got it fairly organized. And then we hit another recession or something.
Sorry, thanks.
I would just say, kind of the infrastructure question with Susan mentioned with as far as upgrading the village's sewage treatment plant, which they're looking at, and certainly good for protecting the water quality. There's a federal infrastructure bill that was just passed. There's going to be a $4.2 billion bond act, state bond act for the environment on the ballot this November. There's probably going to be opportunities for water quality infrastructure upgrades that haven't existed for a generation, and we should be preparing and trying to put ourselves in the position to be able to try to access those kinds of funds.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that we have is the federal government has, culminated a 40-year-long retreat from financing affordable housing. I mean, if this was 1985, 1990, we'd have, I don't think this thing's doing much. So, I think what Fred suggested is exactly right, is we have infrastructure money. Infrastructure is politically palatable in the Congress. Affordable housing is not. The environment is something people will invest in. So I think part of the creativity here is figuring out how to use the financial sources we have, environmental and infrastructure, to reduce some of the costs and create some of the basic systems that makes housing more affordable for everybody, particularly locating it in areas where we know we can build affordable housing. So it requires a strategy at the local government level about how they apply for that infrastructure money, how they use that environmental money to do it in a way that will indirectly make housing more affordable for everybody. But let me just touch on one of the hot buttons here. You know, I believe very strongly in the historic character of both Sag Harbor and the East End. It's one of the things we all treasure. Historic preservation in many places around the country, like the adherence to the single-family zoning code, has been used by NIMBYs as a way to increase the price of housing. And people have very cynically, sometimes very deliberately, used the sort of sacred statement of historic preservation as a way to make communities more exclusive. Now, there are many values in historic preservation. It is part of why many of us live here. It's part of the heritage we've been bequeathed. But is there a way that we can think about historic preservation in which it is a value that we're going to balance in ways that also do not drive up the cost in ways that are difficult to accept for affordable housing? Susan?
Without a doubt there is.
Yeah.
My other crazy background is in historic preservation. I worked at the National Register and the National Trust for a little bit during school. Absolutely there is. If you look at the great homes of Newport, when we had a huge recession multiple times, many of those houses were threatened by demolition or demolition by neglect. And in some instances, some of them became condos or apartments. There was absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. And that doesn't mean you have to change the outside a lot. You might have to allow an extra staircase, or you may have to enlarge an exit-way window like I was planning to do on Main Street. I figured out how to do it without going to the ARB. It can be done, and it should be done. And that doesn't mean that you're not respecting that it's a National Register Historic District and a Village Historic District. It just means that what's inside the building should not drive it to always be single family.
You want me to comment on that? Well, I think it just goes back to what I said before, which anything we do has to fit within the character of the village. They don't have to be at odds with each other, so.
Yeah, and I guess just what I would add to that, and first of all, to agree with Susan, historic preservation in New York State, at least, and in the village, it's the exterior of the building where the ARB or the Historic Preservation Board has jurisdiction. So it's certainly, I think you can maintain those exteriors and the character and still implement some of these ideas about two-family homes or accessory apartments, things of that nature. I don't think that they're inconsistent. The only other thing I'd want to add to this is, you could make that argument about historic preservation. You could also make that argument about things that have been done here for either water quality protection or for open space preservation. When people say, well, if you hadn't preserved so much land, you'd have affordable housing. That's like the most false of false choices,
Nonsense.
in my opinion. A community is supposed to have, every town, every village is supposed to have a well-balanced, comprehensive plan. You're supposed to identify the areas that should be preserved and protected, where the housing should be, where you want, where business development should be, where commercial should be. And you shouldn't ever be in the position where somebody says you need to trade one of those off for the other. There needs to be, to really balance all the things that make the community special and come up with solutions that respect all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It really is a question of balance and saying that, if you're only solving for the environment, if you're only solving for water quality, and you're not also solving for something also essential to our character, which is the inclusionary and diverse character of who's allowed to live here. On the other hand, if we reverse that and say, well, the only value is affordability, and we're going to take our precious natural resources and degrade those, and take our water quality and degrade those, and lose our open space. So it is a question of balance, but looking at every single thing we do through multiple lenses, including, are we making steps towards keeping these villages places where many different kinds of people and different incomes and different family sizes can all live, or we end up having preserved the physical character of our towns and lost our heart and soul, which is, so much of what's happened, I think, over the last generations here, due as I think Michael said earlier, the power of the market and the just massive failure of the market to create affordable housing, which it's not designed to do. So we have about, I think, 5 more minutes left before we can pass it on to our next good panel. I don't want to impinge on their time. Let me ask each of you to just, if you could ask this group to do one thing to help you in your role, whether or not it's as a state elected official, as the head of a zoning board, as a leader in our village government, if this group would do one thing to help you exercise the kind of leadership that you've done over your careers, what would you ask this group to do? How can they help?
Well, I would say continue doing what you're doing, participating, coming out, showing your support, or offering your ideas, and hold us accountable. Hold your elected officials accountable. I mean, this issue, like I said, people coming up to me asking for housing, something I took very personal. Come out when legislature is put out there to vote on, vote, participate. I believe in November, Fred, there's going to be on the ballot in both townships.
That's where I'll be using my 2 minutes.
There you go. So I don't want to steal Fred's thunder. Not that I ever could, but come out and support those things. Offer your ideas. Just continue to participate. That would be what I would say. Go ahead, Fred.
Thanks.
Shock us, Fred, here.
Yeah. I didn't step on the lead there, but one thing concrete that you can do is, we passed legislation last year. Governor Hochul signed it, authorizing the towns to have a community housing fund. It is it's the sister of the Community Preservation Fund. As you said, you need that balance. And, I've been trying to get the Community Housing Fund part of that balance passed for better than 15 years, and now we have the chance to do it. This is a fund where each of the towns have to put together a plan. They have to tell the voters how they're going to spend the money. Okay, it's affordable housing. How are they going to identify the problem in the plan, and how are you going to solve the problem? So when you go to vote, you'll know how your town is going to use the money. But you will have that opportunity this November. This is a fund that, if it's enacted across the 5 towns, would generate over $600 million for affordable housing between now and 2050, which the towns could bond against now to jumpstart their affordable housing program. So the one thing that I think people can do more than anything is to vote for that referendum this November. All of our towns, all of our villages, all want to do the right thing, and they have been. You heard Bonnie Cannon talking about the Southampton Housing Authority. They do a great job. The East Hampton Housing Authority does a great job. There are projects that all the towns have done, and they've gotten a state assistance, and they've been able to do those projects. It's not enough. It takes more money, And this is the only resource, I think it's, you may not love the idea of another tax, but it's the best idea, I think, that we have right now, to be able to generate the resources that are needed to really tackle affordable housing. So that's the one thing I would ask you to do. Thank you.
Susan?
Well, A, keep doing what you're doing, but B, one of the things we did at this other place that I was at is we brought 3 expert developers in that built affordable housing of all types. And we got the regulatory elected officials off-site, the mayor and council board, and so they wouldn't be disturbed by an assistant running in with a note or something. And it was basically an educational opportunity for the elected officials. And what came out of that was wonderful, because we had a series of 15 recommendations from an affordable housing committee that included developers, surveyors, obviously a tenants organization, architects. It was the gambit, residents, but it was a core group, and they invited these and paid for these 3 consultants. And at the end, we had this laundry list of what needed to be done: building permit fees, infrastructure participation, etc. And each one of the elected officials said, which one do we need to do now? And each one of those 3 people said, all of it. You put everything up there on the wall, and you'll get what you want.
I think, to build on what Fred said, that there are challenges our communities have faced for a long time. The preservation of our open space, the preservation of our environmental quality. We've never solved these problems. They remain challenges today, but we've made enormous progress. And if we're vigilant and we keep organizing, you make positive change. The character of our communities is not just these physical assets, as I said earlier. It is about who we allow to live here, who we welcome into our communities, and keeping our communities racially diverse, keeping our communities diverse by income and by family size. We're not going to solve this problem. We can address it, though, and we can make important steps forward. I think what these 3 treasures have said, is that they're doing, whether or not they're in state government, whether or not they're on the town boards, whether or not they're in the zoning board, they need your help. They need your help showing up, advocating, showing that you care. These institutions listen, and the people they listen to are us, and they listen to our neighbors, and they listen to our friends. And I think one of the most important things we can all do is to be incessant, loud, and persistent voices, and be in for the long haul. Because I hope we'll pass the fund in the fall. I think it's absolutely essential. And then that's an enormous step forward. And then what's the next step? And then what's the next step? And what's the next step? And how do we keep, exactly. At some point we may not eat the elephant, but at least maybe we'll take a significant bite out of its hide. So I thank you for coming, and I thank the 3 of you mostly for your leadership over generations for our communities. Thank you.